Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Summer Blockbuster Movies of 2015. So between May and August, I saw 10 big blockbuster movies, and this video is where I rank them from worst to best. So I only saw 10 movies this summer, so if a movie isn't on the list, it means I didn't see it. I tried to see the biggest box office blockbusters that were released in that time, so this list is for the typical summer blockbusters rather than any indie films that happened to come out over the summer. However, I only saw the movies I wanted to see or that looked okay. If there was something I thought looked so bad I avoided it, like Pitch Perfect 2 and Entourage. And then there were several movies that I just couldn't be motivated to see, like Trainwreck and Southpaw. And then there were some films that film critics absolutely hated, so I stayed away from, like Minions, Pixels, and The Fantastic Four. So these are the 10 summer blockbuster movies I did see as I rate them from worst to best. Coming in at number 10, and thus the worst movie I saw this summer, is San Andreas. I thank the critics for warning me off of Pixels and The Fantastic Four, which I was planning on seeing. However, the critics failed me when it came to this film, which received somewhat positive reviews and was at 50% on Rotten Tomatoes. However, this film was utter garbage, no better than 2012. In fact, I'd even go as far to say it was worse than 2012 because at least that film had somewhat interesting characters and decent actors, where the characters in this film were typical cardboard cutouts and the action was just way over the top. You had that stepdad dude who seemed like a normal realistic character at first, but soon descended into cartoon villainy territory. It was just ridiculous. If you're sensitive about spoilers, you may want to skip this next part, but honestly, this movie is so predictable, I don't think anything could be classified as a spoiler. But at the end of the film, where the surviving heroes are looking over the city that had just been utterly destroyed and millions of people died, and the wife turns to the rock and says, what do we do now? And at first I was really taken aback by that line because it was just so unrealistic that someone would talk like that after almost having been killed about like 20 times and looking at a disaster where millions died. But then The Rock gets this like big heroic look on his face, lifts up his chin and is like, now we rebuild. And then the shot pans this huge American flag fluttering in the wind with the huge swell of this cheesy heroic music. Da 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 da. Now, I want you to understand something. I'm typically not one to laugh at movies that are meant to be serious. I've never been a fan of movies that are so bad that they're good. That's never been my thing. But that scene was so goddamn cheesy I couldn't help myself. I lost my shit and I was cracking up laughing. I just could not believe a movie could so blatantly be so cheesy and dumb. I mean, this movie was pretty cliched and cheesy throughout, but that was just way over the top. As soon as he was like, and now we rebuild, I was just like, oh my fucking god, that's so stupid! The film dropped a whole point for me for that scene alone. So my rating out of 10 for San Andreas is a 2, extremely poor. It doesn't get a 1 because it was mildly entertaining throughout and never boring, but that was the only thing good about this movie. Critics were far too generous to this giant piece of crap. Number 9 is Tomorrowland. I heard some people say they hated this film because Lindelof was involved in writing it, so I was expecting it to introduce all this weird shit that didn't make any sense and mysteries that were never resolved, but that actually didn't happen. In fact, I would have no idea Lindelof was involved unless someone told me, and or by seeing his name in the credits, and you can't tell by the film itself. But the film itself was mildly entertaining, but there was nothing out of the ordinary about it. There was nothing to differentiate it from the billions of other blockbusters that came before it. And the third act of the film was so poorly executed and rather boring, and the political messages behind it were too on the nose to be effective. And in the end, it was a lot of special effects and cool imagery that didn't really amount to anything. In other words, all style, no substance. So my rating for Tomorrowland is a 4 poor. Number 8 is Terminator Genisys. So this kind of got mixed reviews, and most of them not very good, so I wasn't expecting much, but from some of the positive reviews, it sounded like it'd be better than Terminator 3 and Terminator Salvation, which was, not saying much since both those movies suck beyond belief. And of course, I knew it would be nowhere near as good as the first two Terminators, so the big question to me was it going to be as good as the TV show The Sarah Connor Chronicles? And the answer, unfortunately, was no. It too was entertaining throughout and had some good sequences, but ultimately was just too convoluted and had its head up its own ass. I heard a lot of critics say this movie was too confusing, maybe to the typical summer blockbuster audience, but I wasn't the least bit confused. I didn't have a hard time following the plot. It was just stupid. And the worst thing about it is the portrayal of Kyle Reese. I know a lot of people like to rip on Jai Courtney, and he is pretty unremarkable, but honestly, it wasn't him that ruined the character as much as is the way he was written, because he was written as a soft and gentle soul with an almost childlike quality to him, whereas Kyle Reese, as played by Michael Biehn in the original Terminator, was a huge badass who was hardened and traumatized by war and was always on his toes, and this character was absolutely nothing like this, so I just couldn't buy that this was Kyle Reese. Also, I don't know why these idiot writers keep thinking it's a great idea to erase the events of the first two Terminators. The TV show did this as well. That's beloved material, and there's a reason why people like Terminator in the first place. So just leave that fucking material alone. Jeez. Although I did like how the film paid homage to the first one, and it was interesting at times, so it didn't totally suck like Terminator 3. I mean, seriously, fuck that movie. But still not very good. So my rating for Terminator Genisys is a 4 poor. Number 7 is Spy. This is another film that critics were too generous to. In fact, the only reason I saw this movie in the first place was because of the glowing reviews it received, as it was at 94% on Rotten Tomatoes. Because the film looked really stupid to me, and I will say this for it. It didn't totally suck. It did manage to keep me entertained, and I even cracked a few laughs at times, but ultimately it was just a typical action comedy with jokes, nothing new, and things I've seen before a billion times. I'm sure it's probably just not my thing, as I've always avoided Melissa McCarthy movies. This was the first one I've seen, and I gotta say, if this is her best film, then I'll continue avoiding her films. I mean, it was sometimes funny, like Jason Statham's character was funny at times, but they just totally overplayed that joke. And that Italian character guy, Aldo, I think his name was, wasn't the tad bit funny, and it didn't really seem to fit into the movie at all. Really, if you want to see a good spy comedy, just watch Austin Powers or Johnny English. Both are much funnier and more entertaining than this film. So my rating for Spy is a 4 poor. Number 6 is Avengers Age of Ultron. This movie didn't suck by any stretch of the imagination, but on the other hand, it didn't really offer anything new either as far as superhero movies goes. It's pretty forgettable. It's only been a couple of months since I've seen it, and I have a hard time remembering what happened in it, as it wasn't really that great. I mean, it did sort of keep me on edge of my seat, and had moments that were really exciting, but it suffered even more than the first Avengers movies for the over-the-top action sequences, and that just blend together and become too much. Plus, the ending with the Hulk didn't buy it. It just seemed to come out of nowhere, and it didn't really give me a reason to care about it at all. But this was definitely an entertaining film, but nothing special. So my rating for Avengers Age of Ultron is a 5 average. Number 5 is Jurassic World. So when I first heard they were making another Jurassic Park movie, I was just like, why? 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 I've never been that big of a fan of Jurassic Park. I mean, I like the first movie all well and good, but I don't see it as a masterpiece as many others seem to. And essentially, every Jurassic Park movie is the exact same thing, dinosaurs going around killing people. So when I went to see this movie, my expectations were on the floor. I mean, seriously, they could not have possibly been any lower. So that's probably why I enjoyed this movie. I mean, there were plenty of scenes that were ridiculous. There was a lot of useless character subplots that was just a total waste of time and poorly done, and all the characters were two-dimensional and cliched, but I was totally expecting all that, so I was okay with it. Ultimately, it exceeded my expectations for being the first Jurassic Park sequel to actually do something new and take it in a new direction, as it showed an actual functioning park, and it had this guy training raptors to fight on his side. That not only was awesome, but it pulled off in a surprisingly believable manner. And I like the ultimate allegory of the film about how corporations involved were all about making bigger, badder dinosaurs in order to make more money. That they didn't quite think through the consequences, even if it was pulled off in an on-the-nose, clunky manner. But it was most definitely the best Jurassic Park sequel ever made. So my rating for Jurassic World is a 6 good. Number 4 is AntMan. This movie was surprisingly good, and I think the reason I liked it better than Age of Ultron and some other comic book movies is that it wasn't over the top with all these crazy, outrageous action sequences. Really, it seemed like every other comic book movies feels the need to be more and more over the top with their action and CGI, and it all just ends up blurring together and not making any sense. Whereas this film stuck to a simple heist plot, and it stuck to it and did it well. Overall, the film was 75% setup and 25% payoff, but you didn't really care because the characters were really interesting and well developed, and they were very effectively blended humor in with the action, unlike Spy, which was over the top in both its action and its comedy. Ant-Man was a nice, down-to-earth action comedy with some great acting by Michael Douglas, Paul Rudd, Evangeline Lilly, Michael Pena, and that dude from House of Cards that played the villain. This movie was just worked and flowed so well and was a well-constructed film. That was certainly entertaining without any glaring flaws. So my rating for Ant-Man is a 7, very good. Number 3 is Mad Max Fury Road. I'll give a mild spoiler warning for this movie. I think it's okay, but if you're really finicky about spoilers and don't want to know absolutely anything about the movie, you might want to skip this movie and go on to the next film. So the reason why I wanted to see this film is because the critics were absolutely in a tizzy over this film. They absolutely loved it. And in fact, there's one YouTube critic whose opinion I typically trust who said this was one of the best action movies of all time and said it was up there with Die Hard and Terminator 2. So that really piqued my curiosity, so I wanted to see it if it lived up to all this hype. And it didn't. Was it a good film? Sure. Absolutely. Was it one of the best action movies of all time? Not by any means. Now, I will confess to not being a huge Mad Max fan, ultimately because the film seemed to lack any, storytelling and seemed to be all about the action. Movies like Die Hard, Predator, Terminator 2, and Total Recall are good not because the action is really dazzling, but because of the way the action is used to tell an effective story. And I found that a bit lacking here. Don't get me wrong, I really liked this movie. It was really good at being what it was. It had a very effective characters. It had me on the edge of my seat, but ultimately the whole movie was about these people going for a truck ride while a bunch of assholes chase them. And then when they get to their destination, they go, "On second thought, let's not go there. 'Tis a silly place." And then just turn right around and go back right where they came from, while a bunch of assholes chase them. So it's basically a 2-hour-long car chase. But it's the best damn 2-hour-long car chase you can imagine. But ultimately it lacks any complexity, and I'm sorry, but I'm a stickler for complexity. So this movie was certainly enjoyable and well executed, which is why it ranks in at number 3, but it isn't one of the greats by any means. So my rating for Mad Max Fury Road is an 8, extremely good. Number 2 is Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. So I was a huge fan of the first Mission Impossible. I thought it was a really great mind-bending spy flick. So when Mission Impossible 2 came out, I went and saw it because I was expecting more of that greatness, and instead what I got was a giant piece of garbage. Mission Impossible 3 and Ghost Protocol were better than 2, but still did not live up to the original, as they had many flaws and fell into way too many cliches. In fact, I was very skeptical about this film because many critics were saying it wasn't as good as Ghost Protocol, and I thought Ghost Protocol wasn't that great in the first place. But thankfully, I just learned that they were wrong, and for some reason they just liked Ghost Protocol way more than I did, as Rogue Nation was finally the Mission Impossible sequel I've been waiting for all this time, and it was finally a worthy successor to the first film, and finally managed to recapture some of the magic and intrigue. Although this film did fall into many Bond tropes, maybe even more so than other Mission Impossible films, that it had the typical Bond women, a villain sidekick who felt very much like Oddjob, and Tom Cruise walking around acting all suave. But ultimately, it still found it to be very well put together and executed action flick. The thing about this film I think that works the best is that it finally presents a worthy adversary for Tom Cruise and his team that continues to beat them at every turn. And to me, this really raised the stakes. All the action pieces worked to enhance the story and weren't just there to look cool. Plus, I totally bought that Bond woman, who was definitely an interesting addition to the film. So it was a great spy action flick, but a spy action flick that fell into all the cliches, so not one of the greatest movies of all time. But a lot of fun. So my rating for Mission Impossible Rogue Nation is an 8, extremely good. And my number 1 favorite summer blockbuster of 2015 is Inside Out. Now, I'm not typically the one who goes all goo-goo for Pixar films, as there are a lot of Pixar films that people make a big deal out of, like Toy Story and its sequels, Monsters, Inc. and Incredibles, which I really didn't think are all that great. And there's a few Pixar movies I think flat out sucked, like Cars. But there are a couple of Pixar films I do consider greats and classics, such as Wall-E and Finding Nemo, and I count Inside Out among them. This film is, in my opinion, some of the best of what Pixar has to offer. This film was really effective and really cerebral. In fact, many critics say this film is more aimed at adults than it is children, and I can kind of see that. Although there's plenty on the surface for kids to enjoy, it never seems to go out of its way to tell childless jokes in order to humor the kids, like most kid movies do. And it tells a very complex story that examines one's own emotional makeup that's really complex and thought-provoking. I could imagine many child psychologists loving this film, and it's probably going to be shown at schools a lot to help children understand the complexities of their emotions. That being said, this film isn't perfect. It had a few glaring flaws, such as the whole adventure the two characters go on that does seem a bit convoluted, and it almost seems like the movie would have worked better had they just stayed in the control room. In fact, I would recommend watching the How It Should Have Ended video for this, as I think they do a good job in pointing out the flaws in the plot. But overall, the film was very effective, and I must admit I even shed a few tears at the end, and I was sitting in the theater trying to pretend I had something in my eye. And it's such a simple story, as it's basically just about a 12-year-old girl upset over having to move across the country and wanting to run away from home. You know, that's such a simple story that we've seen dozens of times before, but they managed to tell it in a truly unique way. So my rating for Inside Out is a 9, excellent. So that's it for my top 10 summer blockbusters of 2015. Be sure to check out my channel for many other film and TV reviews, including reviews on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, and Lost. And be sure to subscribe to keep up with future videos I'll be doing. And thanks a lot for watching.